Hello. Welcome to Faculty Friday at the Joseph Korbel School of International Studies here at the University of Denver. I'm Fritz, Dean of the Korbel School, and we're pleased that so many of you are joining us today. The past 3 weeks have really changed the world. What was once unthinkable is now happening before our eyes. Russian tanks, missiles, bombs, destroying the cities, the country of Ukraine, a country that posed no military threat to it, near medieval sieges of cities, probable war crimes, extraordinary events. And of course, we've also seen an unprecedented response from the West, sanctions of all forms, putting a vice on Russia's economy. The repercussions of what are happening are just profound. In some sense, it represents the true end of at least the dream that Russia would become part of the world liberal order. So it's extraordinarily timely that I am joined today by Korbel professor Rachel Epstein to talk about Russia's war against Ukraine. Professor Epstein is a scholar of Central and Eastern Europe, who's written extensively on NATO enlargement and its implications, democratization in the region and its challenges. Her publications include NATO enlargement and the spread of democracy, evidence and expectations in pursuit of liberalism, international institutions in post-communist Europe, and most recently, banking on markets, the transformation of bank-state ties in Europe and beyond. Well, welcome to Faculty Friday, Rachel.
Thank you so much, Fritz. I wish it were under better circumstances.
Indeed, indeed. I should mention that Rachel and I will talk for about 40 minutes, and then we'll open up for questions. So please put your questions in the Q&A box. I should also note that Rachel is also here as the Senior Associate Dean at the Korbel School. And we work very closely together on the business of the school, but it's a particular pleasure to be able to talk substance with Rachel today. So Rachel, let me start with this. Your work, so much of your work has been on the project of integration of Eastern Europe into the global economy and the liberal order. Imperfect to be sure, uneven, as you have written, but certainly part of the larger project of pulling that region and indeed Russia into the kind of liberal order. Did you ever imagine that we would be where we are today?
So I didn't necessarily imagine this kind of scenario. I think what surprised me about it, upon learning about the massing of troops on Ukraine's border in particular, what I thought was going to happen was a minor set of incursions that would result in what Russia has done very frequently in its near abroad, just to create a frozen conflict, which essentially takes a country permanently out of consideration for the Western sphere of influence in a way. I thought that's probably what Putin and Russia would do in this instance. And so the overwhelming scope of the invasion has been a surprise. But in a way, I probably shouldn't have been surprised, because after many decades of being in touch, in particular with Poles in the region, they would have also told me in 1995 this was always possible. They would have expected it. So certainly people in the region would have seen this coming, I think, more than many Americans would see it coming.
So that raises or leads us to the big question. I mean, it wasn't what you and I think most observers expected. It is what I described at the outset. It seems almost madness. The costs to Russia are incredible. It's hard to understand, I think, for most of us, why, what kind of person would do this? Why are they doing it? So why are they doing it? Why has Putin done this?
Well, I think the main reason, and you said at the outset that Ukraine posed no immediate military threat to Russia. I think that's true. But what we understand about autocratic regimes, it's hard for them to justify their autocratic means of rule if they're surrounded by democratic countries. And in Russia's case, if Russia is surrounded by not just democratic countries, but ones that are Western oriented and increasingly striving for relationships with or membership in organizations like the European Union and NATO, which was, of course, exactly the trajectory that Ukraine had been on increasingly since 2014, but then even more increasingly, I think, since Zelensky came to power in Ukraine. So I think the fundamental issue, which is an existential issue for Putin and for Putin's Russia as it exists today, was the transformation of Ukraine in a way, its westernization, its democratization, for however flawed its democracy was, that did pose an existential threat. And I think Putin's aim ultimately is to cultivate extreme dependence in whatever Ukrainian regime he manages to install on Russia, to guarantee its fealty, its loyalty, its dependence, so that Russia effectively can control Ukraine. It's not just Ukraine for which Putin has these aspirations, but certainly Belarus and also Georgia.
What do you make of, much has been said, I've said some things about, Putin's sort of aspirations to recreate the Soviet Union, or even looking further back in history, as sort of a grand vision of greater Russia, this kind of romantic view. And he certainly has said those kinds of things. What credence do you give to that line of thought, that this is in some ways not that strategic, or even a matter, as you say, of threat in a particular way that you just described, but that somehow it's caught up with this dream of restoration of Russian status in the world, and indeed of its greatness in history?
I don't doubt the drive for a restoration of something grander and more powerful than the confessed humiliation, I think, that many Russians experienced at the end of the Cold War. But I also don't underestimate Putin's desire to instrumentalize those ideas in order to mobilize domestic support. And at particular points, I think he's been extremely successful in doing that. But it is true, Agnia Grigas has done work on precisely this issue, making the case that population movements of Russians in particular, including in the post-Cold War period, are essentially a grand strategy of reestablishing a much larger Russian sphere of influence than was available to the country at the end of the Cold War.
Yeah. Now, you've written about NATO enlargement. You supported it then and continue to support it now. There's a school of thought, the so-called realists, most notably probably John Mearsheimer, who's been in the press, that basically says it's NATO's fault that this happened. This was entirely predictable. NATO posed a threat when it moved east, and that it was almost inevitable that Russia, indeed almost any nation, would respond as it has done. Why do you think that's wrong?
So I should say at the outset that when I started researching this issue in the 1990s, I was very skeptical of NATO enlargement, and I believed it was largely driven by US defense companies' drive to enlarge their market, right? So then I went into the field and found an entirely different set of drivers at work. So that's the first thing I would say about it. It's not, I didn't come into this field of study believing that the alliance, or even its continuation following the Cold War, was necessarily the best way forward. So that's the first thing I would say. The second thing I would say about the realists, and John Mearsheimer in particular, that style of analysis tends to view balance of power politics and the distribution of capabilities as primary, and the content of countries and international organizations is secondary. And what I found in doing the research of the 1990s and early 2000s, which was the research for my first book, was that actually the content of politics, the nature of regimes, it matters enormously for outcomes in international affairs. So and we have lots of evidence of this. So the first thing I would say in answer to this question is that at the very outset of NATO's existence, all the way back in probably 1952, the original Secretary General of NATO was somebody called Lord Ismay. And his observation about the alliance was that it was to keep the Russians out, the Americans in, and the Germans down. And, of those three things,
Hmm.
one of the pieces that turned out to be most relevant in the post-Cold War period was the third piece of keeping the Germans down. But it's a metaphor, right? I mean, by 1990, 1991, we didn't think about needing to keep the Germans down anymore.
Yeah.
But of course, earlier in European history, how to manage and channel German power was the fundamental challenge of managing European politics in the 20th century. So I know this is hard to believe now, given what's going on, but in the 1990s, NATO enlargement was really driven, and Madeleine Albright was one of the main people articulating this vision, was really driven by the perceived need to democratize East Central Europe, eliminate regional rivalries, and create this band of stability, democracy, and peace between Germany and Russia, which had traditionally been so vulnerable and weak.
Yes.
So the keeping Germany down piece is about those features, that is, enhancing market competition, capitalism, yes, democratic stability, but also tamping down regional rivalries. So some of the membership accession criteria included things like Poland, Hungary, everybody. They had to have peace treaties with every single one of their neighbors before joining. They were downsizing their forces, professionalizing their forces, limiting their defense budgets. I know that sounds counterintuitive from today's perspective, but the whole idea was to denationalize their defense postures, keeping in mind that this is a part of the world where there are recently established borders, border disputes, diasporas all over the place, lingering resentments, right? So if you wanted to make sure you didn't have war in Eastern Europe like you did in the former Yugoslavia, NATO as an alliance was imposing these conditions to improve relations between states, not least between states like Poland and Germany. So this will also sound strange, but when I was doing field research for that first book in Warsaw in 1999, I went to a Polish-American Chamber of Commerce event. And at that event, the US ambassador to Poland was speaking. His name was Daniel Fried. And he said, this was just a couple weeks before the first post-communist NATO enlargement of 1999, when Poland, Hungary, and Czech Republic were joining. He said to this group, very sympathetic ears, obviously, in Poland, but he said, NATO enlargement is going to be so great. The alliance has actually been great for Russia. We solved Russia's German problem, right? And you listen to that now and you think, well, I mean, clearly they don't see it that way. But what we sensed in the 1990s, I think what many American policymakers sensed in the 1990s, Russia at that point might have gone in any number of directions, some of which could have been democratic and integrative. That didn't turn out to be the case. But in the 1990s, there was a sense that NATO enlargement could actually be a stabilizing and prosperity enhancing enterprise for the entire continent, including Russia.
Yeah.
And so taken from that point of view, going back to Mersheimer and the realist observations about international politics, the content of the regimes that NATO is trying to establish actually matters more, in my view, than the distribution of capabilities. And I think there's also a moral flaw in the realist view, which is that in Mersheimer's view, Ukraine is simply a buffer state. It should occupy that status. NATO should have never left its door open, neither should the EU, right? And that means you've got 44 million people in Ukraine who effectively don't have democratic sovereignty, right? So I think it's both an analytical failing and a moral failing on the part of the realists to understand that we actually have capacity and agency in constructing a kind of international order in which you don't just have great powers deciding the fates of smaller powers.
So many things we could follow up on that. I'm curious if you think if we had not had NATO enlargement, would something like what we see in Ukraine have happened, or anyway? And to what extent would Poland, Moldova, Hungary, the Baltic states be more vulnerable and at greater risk today than they are.
So they might be both at greater risk vis-a-vis Russia, but also vis-a-vis one another. I think, you know, the great advantage of the American security guarantee, and this is the other piece of Ismay's observation, with an American security guarantee, the Europeans have the maneuver, right? And they're often criticized for this, for not spending as much on defense and not worrying about regional rivalries to the extent that they always had. You know, I realize that in the most recent crisis, Germany is one of the countries that has said immediately we're going to start spending more on defense. And I think under the circumstances that's appropriate. But I am also one of the people who thought it's such a transformation that the alliance in the United States has been begging Germany for years to spend more on defense. If you go back and you read Adam Tooze's Wages of Destruction, which is about the creation of the German war economy in the 1930s, you know, there's no, I think, more profound evidence for the transformational power of certain international institutions than the story of Germany and Europe.
Yeah.
And if we think, you know, it's unthinkable, you know, I shouldn't worry about Germany increasing its defense spending today. It's unthinkable that Germany would take an aggressive position vis-a-vis Poland or France for that matter, right? It's only because the international institutions in which Germany is currently embedded has transformed the way that a country perceives itself in the world and channels its power. And so when I think about the potential vulnerability of that whole strip of post-communist countries that in the meantime have joined the alliance, I'm glad that they're in the alliance, both because they're safer than Ukraine is, because of the Article 5 security guarantee, but I think they also potentially enjoy much more domestic stability for not having to worry about those external threats.
So we've been talking about NATO a lot and issues around NATO enlargement. Ukraine is not in NATO, nor in the EU. And as a consequence, we're not bound by Article 5 to defend it, and have made clear, the US and our allies, that we will not intervene directly in the war in Ukraine. At the same time, we're seeing, you know, every day, truly horrific images of what is happening. And it's hard, I think, for most of us to sit back and say and watch it. I mean, there's a certain sense of helplessness. I think there's growing pressure, at least in this country, to do something. So I'd love your perspective on, you know, why are we're arming them? We're arming the Ukrainians, but you know, why are we unwilling to commit troops in this, even in the face of the horrific things that are happening? Or the no-fly zone, for that matter, or other measures of war?
Yeah, I think the alliance correctly is extremely concerned about escalating the conflict. And what we know about Putin in the more than 20 years that he's been in power is that he has apparently, there are just fewer normative guardrails that he adheres to than much of the rest of the world. Certainly, there are horrible leaders out there who do horrible things, but he's clearly among them, right? So we know he has a history of repression, of poisoning, jailing, killing his opponents. He's used chemical weapons. He's used radioactive material. He is probably allegedly responsible for a series of extremely violent acts against his own people to justify his own rise to power. In the late 90s and early 2000s, this was a series of apartment building bombings across the country. That was, you know, they were used as scare tactics to justify the elevation of a strongman figure, blamed on Chechen rebels, also justified further violence in Chechnya. David Satter wrote a book called The Less You Know, the Better You Sleep, which is a very tight, convincing account of that phase of violence in post-Cold War Russia, which led to Putin's elevation. So the point is, this is a nuclear power. It's also, I mean, Russia is a nuclear power with a vast array of tactical nuclear weapons. And I think, the West, NATO, very reluctant to engage directly, more directly than it already is because of the fear of escalation and creating an even more lethal situation, both for the people of Ukraine and potentially for people outside of Ukraine.
Do you see any scenario in which, perhaps unintentionally, this does spill out across the borders into NATO territory, either because Putin takes some action that to disrupt the flow of arms that's ends up being a kind of provocative act of some kind? Is that a possibility, even with the restraint that we're showing at this point?
It's definitely a possibility, and I imagine that there are many military planners thinking about what are the appropriate and measured responses. So I think there are very many frightening possible scenarios. The problem for the alliance, and of course Putin knows this, the Article 5 security guarantee means that if a single member of the alliance is attacked, the rest of the alliance should come to that member's defense. And Article 5 has only been invoked once, and it was after 9/11. It's a show of solidarity by US NATO allies to invoke Article 5 in that event. And from the alliance's point of view, it's very important that the article be honored. Because let's say there is some kind of incursion in the Baltic states, and those countries feel threatened, their sovereignty is compromised, and the alliance doesn't respond appropriately according to the strictures of Article 5, then every other country in NATO has to wonder, are we also vulnerable? Are we going to be among those protected by Article 5, or for reasons we don't understand, do we fall outside of it? Then you get back to the kind of Lord Ismay's original observation about NATO. If Article 5 doesn't work for members of the alliance, then there's no reason for them to believe that they can retain denationalized defense postures. They go instead for defense self-sufficiency, right? And then the whole rationale for the alliance unravels. And I think for broader European security, even putting Russia aside, we don't want that. So it's an extremely dangerous situation. There are lots of scenarios one can envision of Putin trying to go just far enough to raise the question, I think, for Westerners and for NATO, does this rise to the occasion of putting us into a direct combat role? I would say Putin's longer term strategy has been to divide the alliance, divide the West. This explains why he supported Trump in the 2016 election, right? And I think that's diplomatically the thing the alliance has to be so careful to guard against.
Yeah. Well, that does raise a question to me, anyway, of the extent to which Putin just miscalculated here, and on several dimensions. One has to do, I suppose, with his apparent belief, certainly rhetorical belief or expression, that Ukraine, often called the Ukraine, as a way of diminishing it as a sovereign nation, is really not a thing. It's essentially part of Greater Russia. There's not a Ukrainian identity. It's not a viable state. In essence, that the histories of Russia and Ukraine are sort of one and the same. He seemed to believe that. The evidence is pretty strong that that's not the case. There seems to be a very strong Ukrainian identity and nationality. But why would it have been plausible for him to believe that, to the extent that you think he did?
So Ukraine, doesn't have a history of statehood the way, let's say, Poland did prior to its reinstatement on the map following World War I, right? I mean, Poland had a long history of statehood, then was wiped off the map, and then was reinstated, basically. So Ukraine, the lands that we now refer to as Ukraine, they've been part of Russia's sphere of influence. At a certain point, those lands were under the Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth. Part of Ukraine was in the Habsburg Empire, right? So even if the country doesn't have a strong history of statehood and independence, of course, since 1991, it has been an independent country, and in the intervening decades has, as you just indicated, developed a much stronger identity, and perhaps paradoxically, largely because of Russian aggression, right?
Yeah.
So I was also doing research in Ukraine in 2005. That was right after the Orange Revolution, which was probably the first major public uprising against government dysfunction and fraudulent elections in Ukraine. But even in 2005, when I was there, the support for NATO membership for that country and the public in Ukraine was in the single digits. Currently, it's up to 55%, and that was a recent poll. It's probably not the most recent poll. It's probably even gone higher.
I've seen, yes.
And then for a long time, outside observers, inside observers, thought, well, you might have increasing support for things like NATO membership, but still in the east of the country and the south of the country, you have much more loyalty to Russia and much more national identity with Russia. But even in the 2 years since Zelensky's been in power, that's changed. So in fact, in recent polling data, the areas of the country in which support for NATO enlargement has risen the most is in the south and the east.
No.
So, going back to your original question, yes, I mean, it's true for 300 years, Russia and Ukraine were part of the same political entity with a brief period of independence following the Russian Revolution. At the same time, the changing political landscape has, as you said at the beginning, really cultivated a sense of national identity and independence, separate from Russia, increasingly Western oriented. You and I have talked before about the almost signed 2013 association agreement with the European Union, which Yanukovych was going to sign in 2013, stepped away from it at the last minute under economic pressure from Russia, right? But that was really the inception of the current string of events that ultimately led not only in 2014 for Russia to seize Crimea and to incite violence in the East, but fundamentally links us directly up to the current crisis. So what I can say about Ukrainian national identity, there are so many different elements of its history on which a person could pull to argue it's fundamentally part of Russia, or it's fundamentally always wanted independence, not just from Russia, but also from the Poles. And I would say at this point, that is neither here nor there, right? What's clear now is that if Ukraine were exercising its democratic sovereignty, it would be an independent country, it would be democratic, and it would increasingly be joining the West if it could, right? If it met the criteria, it would join NATO and possibly also the EU at this point.
Yeah, and as you say, I mean, it's almost certainly Russia's actions, even before this invasion, reinforced the sense of Ukrainian identity. And it's hard to imagine, even if Russia succeeds in its military ends at this point, that there will be anything other than a highly oppositional public and possible long-term insurgency and like. So it's hard to see how the actions of Russia actually, accomplish what Putin might think he wanted to accomplish. Let me raise another question, or another dimension in which it looks like Putin badly miscalculated. And you mentioned earlier the tactic or the strategy of Putin was very much about dividing the West in multiple ways, including perhaps in our election and that of Britain's. And the West has been remarkably united in response, gone far beyond what I think any of us expected, and perhaps way beyond what Putin might have expected. How big a miscalculation was that on Putin's side? Do you think he really did believe the West would be weak, feckless, minor sanctions, nothing much, or or did he see this coming and was still willing to do that?
It's a great question. I don't know the answer. I mean, many people have said, and I don't disagree, given the weak, feckless response to seizure of Crimea, war in the East,
Yeah.
maybe he did think that he could launch a full-scale invasion, and because particularly of Germany's energy dependence, that would be enough of a wedge that he wouldn't confront the unity that he currently does in the West. However, I mean, the invasion has been so brutal. The onslaught has been so thoroughgoing. It's hard for me to see that he wouldn't himself have perceived that he would face a unified and determined Western alliance. Particularly, I mean, one wonders also why he might not have undertaken this action while Trump was still in office in the United States, because Biden is a much more effective leader, a much more credible leader of the alliance, much more committed Atlanticist. So that part of it is also puzzling. There's another dimension I didn't answer in your earlier question on the Ukrainian front. Polling data, did show shortly before the invasion that Zelensky's popular approval rating was declining, that a huge number of Ukrainians, also this is the aftermath of the pandemic, right? Every leader has had trouble managing the pandemic. Huge numbers of Ukrainians have wanted to leave the country. So, higher levels for NATO membership notwithstanding, there were pieces of Ukrainian public opinion before this invasion that I think Putin believed would result in more defections from the Ukrainian regime towards the Russian invasion. So that was clearly a miscalculation, I think we're seeing.
Yes.
On the Western side, it's just very hard for me to say what he would have anticipated, except that the general Russian and Putin view of the West is that the West is decadent, disorganized, overly materialistic, hard to unify. It's a sprawling coalition. So that might have been a miscalculation.
Yeah. I mean, he seemed to have thought that they would be able to have a pretty quick victory. And under those circumstances, you might not have seen the extent of the response to the West. I mean, the U.S. is now about to announce the end of most favored nation status for Russia. You see McDonald's shuttering its restaurants. Putin now saying he's going to nationalize those assets. I mean, with every step, he seems to be galvanizing the West to even further actions, and hard to imagine that he saw that all playing out as it has. Let me. It's a big question, and now is where is this headed? What do we and I suppose, is there any prospect for an off-ramp, as it were, a deal? Russia from the outset had demanded that Ukraine pledge not to join NATO, that acknowledge Russian control over the Luhansk and Donetsk regions, and the Crimea, of course. Zelensky recently seemed to be signaling that, of course, he's no longer as eager to join NATO, and that they might well be a neutral country. There seems to be some softening there. As we were just talking about, the war is not going well for Putin. The sanctions seem to really be biting. Not to mention the other, the repressive measures now that Putin's undertaken in Russia. It's not, in some sense, it's not going really well for Putin. Is there a deal here? Do you see there've been talks going on? They've so far been, pretty much fruitless, I think. Do you see a possibility of, in any near term anyway, a deal that leads to a ceasefire and a de-escalation?
So on the NATO enlargement question, think there will be no more NATO enlargement to the east in my lifetime, certainly not in Putin's lifetime. So let's say that Ukraine agreed that was off the table. Is it going to make any difference? In my opinion, maybe not, because I think that prospect has been dead since 2008.
It wasn't on the table before, right?
It wasn't really on the table, right? That's the pretext that Putin uses to talk about this issue. But because Putin's goal is really what I said at the outset, I hope I said it at the outset, right? He wants another Belarus on his border. He wants a leader there who's completely dependent and beholden. So the problem, I think, for Putin and for Russia in this war, a negotiated settlement along those lines seems unlikely, because under continued Ukrainian independence, particularly under Zelensky's leadership, you continue to have this problem of a country that potentially is increasingly democratic and Western oriented, and all of the actions that Putin takes tends to cultivate a certain aversion to Russian influence and leadership, right? And if that's the thing that Putin is most worried about, the negotiated settlement of the kind that you just mentioned doesn't get him there. Now, there's a point at which Putin might nevertheless have to accept Ukrainian independence under Zelensky or somebody like him who's not going to be dependent, because his own standing at home becomes so imperiled. So what we know, this is a triple crackdown. It's happening in Russia. It's a crackdown effectively also in Belarus to quash any hopes of the democratic opposition there, which came in the summer of 2020 from reemerging. Thirdly, in Ukraine, right? And at home, Putin is using incredibly repressive measures to control the information environment and to stop protests, brutally arresting people. Oligarchs are obviously the target of some of the sanctions. So the question is, how long can a leader like Putin rule with an iron fist without fissures in his own regime emerging? If they do, then a deal along the lines of what you described might be possible, because he might rather, retain what he has, at least in terms of his leadership position, than be deposed. But short of, I think, direct threats emerging to his role in Russia, it's going to be hard for him to settle for something less than total dependence of Ukraine on Russia.
And just to follow up on that, I mean, the strategy of sanctions targeted at oligarchs around him, targeted generally at the economy of Russia, is, theory of change there is that there'll be sufficient pressure that we see these fissures, that people recognize that this is really bad for Russia. The history of the efficacy of sanctions, however, is not that great. We were talking about this before. In the narrative that Putin is spinning for domestic consumption, of course, Russia is the victim, and that it was purely defensive, whatever measures it might be taking in Ukraine. It's not really acknowledging very much about it. In that world, the measures we take are somehow reinforcing of the narrative that the West is out to destroy. That's what he says. The West is out to destroy Russia, and you get a kind of nationalist response. I suppose it's an impossible question to really answer and to predict. But what do you make of the probability of these sanctions actually forcing regime change in Russia?
So, very reluctant to make predictions. What we know is that the oligarchs have all kinds of ways around the sanctions. We're just reading about the United Arab Emirates and the loopholes that country, but probably many others as well, provide for people of the wealth and power of Putin's circle of oligarchs. In addition, the chances of oligarchs moving against Putin are diminished by the fact that essentially their continued access to wealth and privilege depends on Putin, right? In his restructuring of the oligarch structure in Russia, he eliminated their independence and cultivated their loyalty and dependence. So that is a tough nut to crack. In terms then of whether the public could exercise pressure, of course, we know that becomes ever more difficult with the more repressive measures that Putin undertakes at home, the more people who are arrested, the more independent media outlets that are shut down, the more foreign correspondents go home, right? It becomes harder also for people in the domestic scene to take any action, right? I don't want to make it sound like any leader is, untouchable. I'm sure Putin isn't, but he's clearly thought this through. And he's created a context in which it's really hard to imagine the conditions under which particularly sanctions pressure forces a change. There have already been so many actions taken that, in terms of sanctions on the central bank in Russia, that make it extremely difficult for that regime to combat the economic consequences. That's for the good. But we also know that people, leaders, publics, they can sustain economic deprivation for a very long period of time without taking any action against the leader who's putatively responsible. And then there's the issue that you raised, which is it gives the regime an opportunity to blame the West for the deprivation.
Yes. I want to turn to questions from the audience. So we have a number of them in the queue, and I'll get to that. One last question, though, Rachel, from me anyway. In a way, it returns to the conversation about Mearsheimer and the realists. And you and I've talked some about this, but love your thoughts on the extent to what is what is at stake here really, in some fundamental ways, about the nature of the international order. We've long sort of been talking for years now about the decline of, and perhaps even the end of the liberal order created in the post-World War II period, largely by the United States. It does seem, in a sense, this is a contest to see whether Mearsheimer is right or the liberal institutionalists are right, if we put it that way. That is to say, are we returning to some world in which international law, international norms, international institutions have little bite, and it's really about spheres of influence and power? Or is this a moment where we see a kind of a rejuvenation of some version of a liberal order as manifested now by the at least for the moment, united response of the West? What are your thoughts about that?
So we don't have, and we never have had, I think, a single international order. And we still don't, and we won't, right? I mean, I think, as we have talked about before, following World War II, there was clearly a spheres of influence approach to international politics, including in Europe. And that really worked to the detriment primarily of East Central Europeans who were effectively taken over by the Soviet Union. And as we've also talked about before, that was with the kind of nod and winking of Western leaders together with Stalin to divide up Europe in a way that conferred no democratic sovereignty on hundreds of millions of people. When the Cold War ended, right? So I'm not sure if I misspoke following World War II. When the Cold War ended, the West at least took a different approach, which was to no longer allow hundreds of millions of people to be consigned to a fate over which they had no say, right? And that is going back to a debate between realists and constructivists in international politics, evidence that we don't have to privilege so-called great powers ahead of everybody else, that there can be such a thing as democratic sovereignty, that self-determination among populations, also coming out of the post-colonial era, clearly important for people's emancipation around the world. And so that's been a movement, and that's been a feature of international politics, disconfirming everything the realists say about how international politics work. The transformative power of international institutions that I've talked about completely changed European politics, completely changed the character of Germany. Still more evidence that the content of regimes matters more from the distribution of capabilities, right? So, but that world exists side by side with Putin's regime, which insists that it does have a sphere of influence. It should be able to control the countries around it. It shouldn't have to confront democratic and Western-oriented countries on its border. Really not for any reason that I can see, except that it's a threat to Putin's power.
Yeah.
Right.
Yeah.
And so that is a battle of values and ideas, which the United States and NATO hoped to wage with ideas and elections and NGOs and aid.
Yeah.
And, we're confronted with other countries. And I'm not saying that the United States is a pacifist power. Of course, it's not. Right. So we need to be critically reflective of US conduct in international affairs as well all the time. But in this particular episode, Putin clearly has a different view of how international politics should operate.
Yeah. Yeah. And we still have a stake in perhaps proving him wrong. Let me turn to questions now from the audience. We have, we'll get to as many as we can. The number of great questions here. Let me just start. Sid Brooks, a question really about the ability to get information to the Russian people. He asks, is it impossible to communicate with the Russian people through things like Radio Free Europe and Radio Liberty and, with the mechanisms of the past, or are there more modern high-tech equivalents that enable truth, information, facts to actually get through to the Russian people?
It's a great question. It's increasingly difficult, I think, to get information into Russia. I think we also have to be aware that information is not just information, right? It's not just information in the sense that, Sid, I just taught a course with Transparency International Hungary, right, where we've also seen incredible, disturbing democratic erosion over many years. The Hungarian population has the information about their own government's corruption, and they do not vote against it, right? So what I'm saying with respect to information diffusion in Russia, of course, we should be trying to get accurate information into the country, knowing, though, that foreign correspondents are leaving in droves. The independent media there has been totally shut down. Social media is being shut down, right? So it's difficult, but also know that even if there was widespread knowledge, more than there is now, about Russia, what Russia was actually doing in Ukraine, you shouldn't necessarily expect very different behavior in the public, because people have all kinds of things at stake aside from just acting what we would consider appropriately on information, right? It's the who's delivering the information, the context in which it's delivered, whether that information can also be mobilized in the service of Putin. That's a very different matter. So while I appreciate the question, the premise of the question, I think we also have to be aware information by itself is not going to be the answer.
Daryl Stickle asked, did the failure of the West, you talked a bit about this, but did the failure of the West to punish or sanction Putin for past transgressions, Georgia, Crimea, et cetera, all the things you mentioned, lead him ultimately to underestimate their resolve with regard to Ukraine?
Yeah, I think the West, so it's difficult, right? I mean, in retrospect, you think, wow, yeah, the West should have been much more determined in its opposition to those earlier border violations. And, as importantly, the United States had been urging Germany for a long time not to allow itself to become as economically dependent as it currently is on Russian energy supplies. So there were a lot of things that it looks in retrospect like the West should have been doing in order to discourage the kind of aggression that we're seeing now. On the other hand, I know that in earlier phases of Western-Russian relations, there was this idea that through engagement, economic and otherwise, dialogue, that, the country would turn itself around in some ways, and that, we still needed to negotiate with the Russians on Syria, on Iran, on climate change. So while it's, it's possible to say in retrospect, yeah, we probably weren't harsh enough earlier on, there were also good reasons to keep those channels of dialogue open. So even in hindsight, I'm not sure what the best way would have been, except to say that there are so many issues on which it would have been so productive to have Russian cooperation. And of course, the current crisis makes that impossible.
Yeah, yeah. Our colleague Nazneen Barma asks that says you've given us a great framework for understanding how international institutions in Europe, EU, NATO have constrained state behavior, particularly Germany, maybe Russia. Flipping the arrow around though, how much pressure does Putin's invasion of Ukraine and subsequent behavior, Germany increasing its defense budget, put on those institutions, and how worried should we be about their weakening or potential weakening in coming years?
So this could go in a couple different ways. I mean, it could be that this invasion does a few things that are constructive, in the sense that it's going to be hard, I think, for any US administration coming in the future to disregard the alliance as some previous administrations have. Right? In some sense, it could be a strengthening of the EU also. The EU has been trying to figure out the ways in which it can be more effective for promoting the return of full democratic governance in places like Poland and Hungary. For Poland and Hungary especially, Orban has long been an admirer of Putin and a close associate of him. And it's hard for me to see how he can continue to do that under current circumstances. So in a way, in response to Naz's question, I kind of see a reinvigoration in a way of these international institutions and of the international architecture that preserves the values that we care about. On the US side, there's also, I think, an opening for reconsidering the value in the domestic context of the United States of democratic institutions, a warning against the excessive power aggrandizement in the executive and the honoring of election results. Because if you don't, it's a slippery slope to tyranny. I mean, many people have made that argument, including Timothy Schneider. So I don't think what I'm saying is a new observation, but it could be that this crisis is kind of the kick in the butt that the West needs to realize what's at stake. And if you're not fighting for that continually, the trouble that you can get into. I think on the going back to Lord Ismay and keeping Germany down, what we know is democratic governance does not move in one direction. You have to be actively engaged to preserve the democratic institutions that confer rights like equal protection under the law. And so, for me, looking at this crisis, at least for me, I want to double down on the values that I think are so critical to enfranchisement and representation.
Yeah. A great point about, the need for constant tending, and we probably are neglect of that for some period of time. It does seem, for the moment, at least, democracy perhaps has taken a hand, or these institutions have been strengthened in the short run. Many other good questions. We'll try to get to a couple more of them here. Kamala Kenyon asks, what is your opinion about the U.S. helping get the Polish fighter jets into Ukraine? Is this still within the bounds of what the U.S. could do without explicit confrontation with Russia? They seem to have had a green light with the U.S., but U.S. support was withdrawn. Then she asks, is not doing anything to help also putting NATO in danger?
That is a great question. I guess I'm going to say I don't really know the answer to that, in the sense that whether it is construed as a more direct combat initiative. What I think what nobody wants is to provide a pretext for Putin to do something even more egregiously dangerous, particularly with chemical or nuclear weapons. And further, what we don't want is an escalation of the conflict into the NATO countries that would provoke a much wider conflagration. So I don't know how the delivery of MiGs would affect that dynamic, but if I were in the Biden administration or any of the NATO countries, I would be extremely leery of doing anything that was excessively provocative. The second part of the question is not doing something also provocative. Also very difficult to answer. These are great questions. I'm not sure I don't know, Fritz, if you have a sense of whether, too much caution, passivity also sends, a negative message in terms of Russia's maneuverability in Ukraine. That's also possible.
Well, that's the form of the argument, I guess, about not responding enough in the past. Does he read this as weakness, as probing? Will he continue to push until he is met with credible force? So the counterpoint to the escalation fear is the kind of appeasement story where he's only will be deterred at that point. I don't know the answer to that, but I think that's the form of the argument. Time maybe for one more, I think. Jack Keenan says, I asked Dr. Epstein to put herself in the boots of a Russian strategist. Putin has surely made a disastrous mistake, but Russia has no natural geographic defenses, have been invaded many times. Don't you need a buffer zone, a Monroe Doctrine? Isn't in essence, isn't Russia's fears, aren't Russia's fears somewhat warranted, given the kind of encircling of Russia by countries that are either in NATO or aligned with the West?
Yeah, so I don't want to dismiss the fear that I think Putin in particular feels about not having that buffer zone. If I didn't make it clear at the beginning, I certainly meant to, which is that a democratic and Western-oriented Ukraine, even if it isn't particularly well armed with a large military, it is an existential threat to Russia under Putin, right? And so the philosophical argument that the question kind of points to, but doesn't really address head on is, was the threat to Russia another land invasion? In this sense, I kind of agree with Daniel Fried. No. I mean, in that sense, NATO really did solve Russia's German problem in terms of the threat of an invasion. But that doesn't mean that the Russians are immune from the forces around them, which are democratizing, economically integrative, and liberal, right? And so that's the threat. And do I think in light of that threat that Russia deserves a buffer zone? No, because fundamentally, in my mind, it's a competition of ideas and values, and they're losing. I'm sorry to put it so bluntly, but also the Soviet Union was a moral, ecological, and economic failure, and they lost. So I know that's, that feeds into the discourse of, didn't the United States and NATO just take advantage of Russia when it was at its weakest? And I kind of resist that interpretation of what I'm saying, because taking advantage of Russia and its weakness was a matter of creating an opportunity for all of the countries between Germany and Russia to experience democratic sovereignty and voice in international institutions, including the EU and NATO, which gives them unparalleled power in the international system, meaning they'd never had that opportunity before, and now they finally have it, and it's better for those populations.
Well, Rachel, I'm afraid we're at time, and we'll have to leave it here. I'm sure all in our audience join me in saying that was just fabulous. Thank you so much for being with us today. This topic is not going away. And in fact, next Wednesday, we will be having a conversation with Dr. Fiona Hill who, as I'm sure most in the audience know, is one of the foremost experts on what is happening in Eastern Europe to continue the conversation. But Rachel, thank you so much. And let me thank everyone who's been with us today.
Thanks, Fritz. I just want to say the Fiona Hill event, which Fritz is hosting, is on Tuesday.
Oh, is it on Tuesday?
On Tuesday.
Thank
It's
you,
on
thank you
Tuesday.
for correcting the record.
So I hope that you will join us either
Yeah.
online or in person. She's going to be on the
10
fifth floor
a.m.
here at
Tuesday.
Korbel.
Sorry, thank you for that.
Yeah.
Very
Thank you so much
Well,
for
I hope
having me,
you'll
Fritz.
join us. All right, thank you all.
Thanks.
Bye-bye.